Good morning. My name is Eli Clemens. I'm a policy analyst here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, independent think tank focused on advancing innovation through tech policy. Today, we are going to be talking about how to address counterfeits from Chinese online marketplaces. I'm joined by a great panel today to discuss this issue. But first, some context. Over the summer, I looked at over 1,000 listings on 3 Chinese online marketplaces, Temu, AliExpress, and SHEIN, looking for potential counterfeits to answer the question of, can you buy and have counterfeits delivered to you on these platforms? I found over 50 likely counterfeits that I thought I would want to order and inspect. I ordered them, inspected them, and I found that roughly half were likely or confirmed counterfeits, confirmed only if the original manufacturer said that it was indeed a counterfeit. So these range from things like this shirt that I purchased on AliExpress that has a infringement of a Ralph Polo logo here. There's also a Tommy Hilfiger looking stripe. So maybe not the world's greatest counterfeit, but still looks like infringement of 2 brands' intellectual property. Also found this Yeti mug. This might be a little more deceptive. I had to look at the fine print on the bottom of this mug to label it a likely counterfeit. Here's a confirmed counterfeit, confirmed by the manufacturer, Dog Treats. And I heard from the manufacturer in this case that someone had purchased these fake treats and had to rush their dog to the hospital. So there's also a product safety angle that goes along with this. Along the same lines, I purchased what the manufacturer said was likely a counterfeit of cold medicine, over-the-counter pharmaceuticals. So really a range of different products. I found the most counterfeits on AliExpress and Temu. So I encourage all the listeners to look into the report where I detailed this test purchase, policy implications, as well as the supply chains behind the counterfeit economy. I recognize that counterfeiting is an expensive and difficult issue for businesses to tackle. That being said, my report's analysis was that these 3 platforms I looked at, in particular AliExpress and Temu, have more work to be done to protect consumers and brands' intellectual property. So switching now from kind of the problem to the solution, today I'm joined by 3 great panelists to discuss how to address this issue, which is really a business, a policy, and intellectual property issue. Just introducing the panelists here. First, we have Camilla Bosanquet, PhD candidate at George Mason University's Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center, where she is researching illicit trade in dangerous counterfeit goods, and is also a retired U.S. Coast Guard commander. Second, we have Daniel C.K. Chow. Daniel is a professor of business law at The Ohio State University. Daniel published the seminal piece, Counterfeiting in the People's Republic of China in 2000, and has long been an expert on this topic. And finally, we have Jake Stewart, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at Entropy, a company using AI-based authentication solutions to detect counterfeit goods. So looking forward to a great discussion today. And to begin, I'd like to ask each panelist to just give a brief, high-level overview of how do you view the issue of counterfeiting on Chinese online marketplaces from your unique perspectives. So let's go in the order of introductions. Let's start with Camilla, move to Dan, and end with Jake.
Thank you, Eli, and I want to thank you for this opportunity. I know that there are many experts amongst our audience, and so let's just jump right to it. I see this issue in terms of asymmetric unconventional warfare. It's clear to me that the proliferation of counterfeit goods across e-marketplace platforms can be understood in terms of financial, cyber, trade, and legal warfare at a minimum. I highly recommend reviewing the strategy document crafted by 2 People's Liberation Army, they were actually in the Air Force, colonels in their 1999 publication entitled Unrestricted Warfare, a document that has been studied widely within U.S. military circles. The strategy articulates non-military approaches to weaken or defeat opponents. And while not technically an official PRC military doctrine, we should view this text as a guide to understanding what underpins Chinese philosophical approach to strategic thinking. Asymmetric efforts specifically discussed in unrestricted warfare include currency manipulation, the disruption of cyber infrastructure and networks, exploiting trade policies, and psychological operations to influence public opinion, just as some examples. The strategy also encourages engagement in what is known as lawfare. And we've seen this in terms of litigation financing and certain patent abuses, for example, forcing IP rights holders to disclose trade secrets in court. And we cannot rule out the power of illicitly gained revenues to corrupt government and law enforcement officials globally. The undermining of good governance anywhere threatens U.S. security and places Americans at risk, both abroad and at home. So I'll stop there. Back to you, Eli.
Great. Thanks, Camilla. Dan? Sorry, Dan, I think you are muted.
Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to start by saying that there is a massive pipeline of counterfeit goods from Alibaba in China to Amazon in the United States, through which millions of dollars, probably tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, are sold on a daily basis. And this pipeline delivers these counterfeit goods manufactured in China to the United States through Amazon. Every day, Amazon makes $1.4 billion in sales. Many of these goods are from China. And what happens is that Alibaba has a B2B business model, business to business, whereas Amazon is a business to consumer. So Amazon is the major supplier of the businesses that sell on Amazon. This then creates this pipeline. Now, Alibaba actively promotes its role as a supplier of goods on Amazon. So if you take a look at their websites, they have many websites and many programs, and they tell you step by step how you can source products from Alibaba to sell on Amazon. And the products you can source on Alibaba, and I've done a study of this, I would say about half of them are counterfeit. And the sellers then get these products from Alibaba, they sell them on Amazon. Now, in the discussion, I can go on and explain why this occurs and why Alibaba is in violation of Chinese law in allowing this to occur. And we can get into a discussion of that. We can also get into a discussion of what I think Alibaba should do. They're probably not going to do it. And Amazon probably is not going to ask them to do it, but I can discuss how a very simple mechanism can completely or almost entirely shut down this pipeline. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, we will be getting into policy a little later. And finally, turn over to Jake.
Thank you, Eli. Appreciate the opportunity to discuss this topic and with both Camilla and Dan, explore how and what we can do collaboratively to try to reduce the problem of counterfeiting, which, as has been mentioned, is extensive and elaborate with how these counterfeiters operate and how marketplaces and platforms are not doing enough in lots of ways to combat that as a problem. At Entropy, we like to say that counterfeiting is not a victimless crime. And our objective is to shed light on the impacts of counterfeiting and all of the negatives that come from counterfeiting as a whole and what counterfeiters are doing operationally, from everything related to human trafficking, slave labor, material compositions, and their extensive hazardous components that counterfeiters apply to their practices, and everything in between. Our objective as an organization is to collaborate with industry, with government, with consumers even, and try to ensure that people understand that cause and effect, and then that consumers make a decision with their wallets to try to help reduce this problem through the entire stream and workflow of what happens today in counterfeiting. Counterfeiters are innovative and creative and enabled in too many ways today, and the problems that exist, and again the cause and effect of all of this, it has extremely hazardous effects to consumers, brands, businesses, and everyone in between, supply chains, et cetera. And so I think it's really important that we have these discussions to try to bring light to these problems and to what counterfeiters are doing as bad actors as a whole.
Great. Thank you all for those high-level takes on the issue. We're now going to turn to a more moderated discussion. And before I dive in, I'd like to say to the audience watching, at any point, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to submit through the Slido app, and we will factor those questions into the discussion. And we will also have time at the end of the hour to focus more closely on those questions. So with that, let's switch to defining the problem a little more specifically. Camilla, your dissertation focuses on counterfeit trade through e-commerce platforms. From your research and maybe also your perspective previously serving in law enforcement and military, how are counterfeit goods entering the U.S. in ways that evade existing safeguards?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Eli. And I guess we could start with the work of my own mentor, Dr. Louise Shelley. She is the founder and director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center, my research center at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Dr. Shelley has written and spoken on this point many times over. She talks about the legitimate supply chains and how they are exploited by criminals to transport illicit goods. I mean, we know this. We all know this, right? That they're, that illicit goods are commingled with legal products, with legitimate commerce. I certainly know this to be true from my own Coast Guard experience working counter drug efforts. I want to recommend to the audience, there's a recent article by Alexander Kupetsatadze. I apologize if I've mispronounced his name, but it was published in the Journal of Economic Criminology in May of this year. It's entitled Uncovering Illicit Trade Practices, Leveraging Trade Data with a Macro, Meso, Micro Approach. And because you asked me about how counterfeit goods are entering the U.S. in ways that evade existing safeguards, I'll share that in this article, it articulates many common methodologies employed by counterfeit goods traffickers. For example, transshipments via less scrutinized ports and free trade zones to disguise points of origin, fraudulent shipping manifests, bills of lading, and customs declarations, purposeful mislabeling of goods with alternate harmonized system or HS classification codes, and fraudulent entity commodity associations. So an example of that would be a manufacturer that produces primarily good X, while the shipment itself is a totally unrelated good Y, as one example. So I would add that the concealment of source of manufacture and or shipment ownership by use of generic or shell companies, let's add that to the list of methodologies, as well as various money laundering techniques, trade-based money laundering, and misinvoicing. Now, the working party to countering illicit trade within the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they've documented how overwhelming volumes of small parcels have flooded international mail processing facilities, while both technologies and intelligence have improved the capabilities of, for example, here in the US, Customs and Border Protection and the US Postal Service inspections personnel to detect shipments of illicit goods, more must be accomplished. And I'll say that with the administration's revocation of the de minimis exception for China and Hong Kong in May of this year, and then for all countries in August of this year, we're going to have to wait and see to see what the long-term impact in terms of any reductions to counterfeit goods imports via small parcels might end up being.
Great, thanks, Camilla. Yes, we're all keeping an eye on CBP's ability to monitor and enforce logo infringement following the end of the de minimis rule. You mentioned the OECD in your remarks, Camilla, and so I'd like to turn now to Dan. The OECD, as well as the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition, have both identified China as the source of the global economy of counterfeits. Basically saying, the most counterfeit goods are manufactured and are originating from China. And so, that's an accepted point. Dan, you've done a lot of research on this topic. Can you maybe talk to, why is it that, counterfeit goods have proliferated in China? Is it, the government turns their eye since it's creating jobs? Or is it maybe some other reason? Could you please talk to that?
Okay, so yeah, my point is that there is a very high degree of social and political acceptance of counterfeiting in China, especially of the types of goods that you find on e-commerce sites. And I would say that most people in China, and I'm talking about the general public, the business community, and as well as the PRC enforcement authorities, think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the sale of counterfeit goods on the internet. If you are, and again, this is a high degree of social, political, and legal acceptance of counterfeiting. So if you're a counterfeiter in China and you, let's say, for example, make counterfeit luxury leather bags, and you want to get leather from a wholesale supplier of leather, if you're a counterfeiter, the wholesale supplier knows you're a counterfeiter. They have no problem in giving you leather to make the bag. If you're a counterfeiter and you go to a retail store, such as an Hermes store, to buy a luxury handbag so that you can disassemble it and you can make a copy of it, the salespeople know you're a counterfeiter. They can spot you right away. They have no problem in selling you a bag. In fact, some of them will take you to a VIP room where you can inspect the bag in private and take your time and take it apart. If the counterfeiter, these stores are known to call the counterfeiter to tell them about new product arrivals. They'll call the counterfeiter to chide them if they haven't come to the store, in a while. So essentially, what they do is that they treat counterfeiters just like anybody else. The counterfeiter is a retail consumer whose business they want to maintain and encourage. And I would say that the PRC enforcement authorities think that there's nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong with the type of counterfeit goods that you find sold on the internet. The authorities believe that counterfeits do not harm the brand owner. The authorities believe that the people who buy counterfeits don't buy the genuine product. They believe that, for example, if somebody buys a fake handbag for $100, that doesn't mean that, the luxury manufacturer lost the sale of the genuine product at $3,000. So they don't believe that counterfeits actually harm the brand owner. In fact, they believe that counterfeiting is beneficial because it allows people who otherwise could not purchase luxury products to get something like a facsimile. So the authorities, the PRC authorities, will enforce laws against counterfeiters, but mainly due to political pressure and pressure from the brand owner. So they're not going to go out and raid a counterfeit factory on their own. If a brand owner comes to them, gives them pressure to do so, they will do that. With pressure from foreign governments, they'll do a campaign, a crackdown. But it's really, their goal really is to appease the foreign brand owner. They have no interest none, in eradicating counterfeiting. And the reason they have no interest in eradicating counterfeiting is because they don't believe it's harmful. In fact, they believe it's beneficial, and they have no interest in putting counterfeiters out of business. The fact that there's so much social and political acceptance of counterfeiting means that counterfeiters have been completely integrated into the legitimate local economy. And so if you eradicate counterfeiting, you're going to disrupt the local economy, and they have no interest in doing so. If Beijing wanted to eradicate counterfeiting, they could do it in 1 month. I mean, eliminate it completely, wipe it off the face of the earth. They could do it in 1 month, maybe 3 weeks. But they have no interest in doing that. So I think that from the perspective of brand owners in the United States, and from the perspective of what to do about online counterfeiting, I think it's important to realize that from a political point of view, you really are not going to be able to expect much help from China, where the goods come and originate, because I think, my opinion, is politically impossible really to have effective suppression of counterfeiting due to the widespread social and political acceptance of counterfeiting.
Great, thanks, Dan. That, as well as Camilla's answer, gives a really good view into the supply chain and kind of what happens before a consumer hits buy on a potential counterfeit. Turning a little bit more towards the listing and online side, Dan, you mentioned luxury handbags, which Jake Entropy is really all about. That's one of the core counterfeit products that you all try to identify. So Jake, kind of from your private sector perspective, when you talk to brands or marketplaces, what do they tell you are some of the biggest challenges in detecting and then ultimately preventing counterfeits being sold online?
So Camilla and Dan really made some great points that we hear pretty continuously from both the marketplace and brand and just industry side of things on the private sector. It really comes down to, in lots of ways, volume and acceptance. The scale at which these counterfeiters are operating, and in the mix of that, the innovative techniques and creative methods that they're applying make it extremely difficult for anyone to really have a huge impact on the problem. I'll just give an example of that. We have recently heard of counterfeiters actually purchasing legitimate seller accounts across various marketplaces to then operate under and slip counterfeits into the mix of authentic goods that they also ship in for verification. So you just think about these distribution channels and these methods that marketplaces and platforms and brands are trying to establish. Counterfeiters are infiltrating them with their networking and with their methodologies. Makes it extremely difficult for marketplaces then to monitor them. And if a shipment of 5,000 items, 4,000 of which are authentic, 1,000 of which are counterfeit or inauthentic, that becomes hugely problematic and a tough scale for these marketplaces and platforms to deal with. So that's a huge component to it. The other side of it, relative to acceptance, is that all of these marketplaces, especially socially, have enabled these distribution channels for counterfeiters. It used to be that you had to go to a black market or to an underground area to purchase these counterfeit goods. And today they're fully embedded, as Dan mentioned, into the distribution channels that as consumers, we're all very comfortable with and familiar with. It's ironic. We are an anti-counterfeiting technology, but daily across platforms like Instagram and Facebook, et cetera, counterfeiters reach out directly to us via DM to sell us counterfeit goods. And the enablement of that across these platforms just continue to make it extremely hard for brands, marketplaces, and people trying to do legitimate business to stop that.
Great, thanks, Jake. Camilla, I wanted to ask one more question. Well, we're still talking about kind of defining the problem. With your Coast Guard experience, I know you've worked on kind of the front lines of law enforcement. And so I wanted to ask, where does counterfeiting and in general IP enforcement fit into a lot of these other law enforcement illicit issues? When we think of these, we think about drugs, human trafficking. terrorism and so on. Is counterfeiting in that discussion, and how does it fit into these other maybe more talked about issues?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it certainly depends agency by agency, I'm going to say. It was certainly nothing that we ever prioritized as U.S. Coast Guard. The fact is, when we were doing our inspections, we were looking for weapons of mass destruction, we were looking for human trafficking, we were looking for drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, those sorts of things. Now, more broadly, there are agencies and entities that are deeply concerned with counterfeits coming into our country and really circulating around the world. You know, I was listening to both Jake and Dan talk about, some things that consumers ought to be concerned about. And gosh, I love both their points, and I wish I wasn't a speaker so I could just take copious notes while they're talking. But I would like to add to something that they've each said by talking about, the harms of counterfeits or the damage done by counterfeits is not exclusively limited to large global luxury brands. You know, small and medium-sized enterprises and entrepreneurs are harmed. You know, if anybody has ever stopped to read the history of, for example, Snapdragon, that protects small and medium-sized enterprises out of Scotland. There's an example of a founder who herself was an entrepreneur who came up with her own product, and it was immediately exploited by Chinese counterfeiters, and she was mad, and that led to her starting a business to try to combat counterfeiters. But there's more. There's the environmental impact by the large volume of counterfeit goods that are coming through, not only in their manufacture, and we saw this with the drug trade. Don't forget, in the manufacture of cocaine and the processing, there are a lot of nasty chemicals involved, and a lot of that, it's toxic, and a lot of that was being dumped into Amazonian rivers and tributaries, right? As one example. But there's the back end of counterfeiting, that these products that are flooding U.S. markets, how do you dispose of them? I mean, I'm thinking of the Gotham City case in New York City. Taxpayers become responsible for disposing of these counterfeit goods, and they pose all kinds of environmental risks. And the conversation around some of these counterfeits, they're analogous to some of the conversations that happen around fast fashion. But I'll also mention that, we're not always talking about counterfeit luxury handbags. We're talking about counterfeit prescription medication, that's been laced with fentanyl. And Eli, you might not know this, but a major research project that I've just been a part of, and it's ongoing within Track, concerns the illicit manufacture of fentanyl precursor chemicals by Chinese chemical companies that are legitimate chemical companies, and they're producing on the order of 2 to 5% of their output are these fentanyl precursor chemicals that can be used for nothing else but the manufacture of fentanyl. And then they're drop shipped by small parcels into the United States to the dirty chemist who lives in your neighborhood. And that fentanyl can be incorporated, it can be sold as fentanyl, but it can also be incorporated into some of this counterfeit pharma. And that's where we're seeing young people especially take Adderall, what they think is Adderall, what they think is, some kind of whatever, Ambien or whatever. I shouldn't mention brand names, but they take pills that their friends give them that's laced with fentanyl. Those are counterfeits. And those counterfeits in part originate in China.
Great, thanks, Camilla. Yeah, there's definitely a serious product safety element to all this that directly impacts people's lives, and especially if if people don't know what they're buying, that's increasingly possible online. I would note from my research that
I'm sorry. And I'm just going to jump in and mention, there are all kinds of other harmful counterfeits, which haven't been mentioned yet on this call. But I mean, the industry knows them. We're talking counterfeit brake pads, talk to A2C2. They can talk all about counterfeit auto parts, counterfeit bicycle helmets that our kids are putting on their heads, and adults that we're putting on our heads, counterfeit baby carriers. These have very serious implications for American families, and they are relying on government officials. And I could talk about that in a follow-up later. But they're relying on the federal government to intervene, obviously in consultation and cooperation with brands themselves, with industry, with the private sector. But it's so much more than counterfeit luxury goods.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I was just going to say, that I showed some examples at the beginning of the call. People might want to buy a counterfeit shirt. Maybe there's some small product safety issue with, you don't know if there's plastic leaching or anything, but you definitely don't want to buy counterfeit medicine. I would note though, moving back to kind of Chinese online marketplaces, in my study, I did look into auto parts and pharmaceuticals. So I did find that this one over-the-counter pharmaceutical, I did not find any prescription pharmaceuticals, and I did not find any likely counterfeit auto parts. I think that maybe some in the aftermarket, but there's also counterfeit supply chains that are not necessarily consumer-facing. So just want to highlight that, two different issues, but definitely relevant. Dan, you'd like to jump in, and then I have a question for Jake.
Okay, so I just say, just to be clear, from what I can see, we're just talking about online counterfeits. Those counterfeits generally do not pose consumer safety issues, because by far the majority of online counterfeits, the products you see, clothing, luxury accessories, toys, shoes. These are by far the majority of the jewelry. These are the types of products you see. And then there are some pharmaceuticals, but the online pharmaceuticals, their defect is that they lack the active ingredient. It's not that they contain poisonous chemicals. So there is certainly a consumer safety issue with counterfeits broadly, but of the types of counterfeits that appear on the internet through these online marketplaces, there's far less of a consumer safety issue, which is why the authorities in China don't care about them, because they don't think they harm the brand owner and they don't think they harm the consumer.
Yeah, Jacob, if you'd like to chime in.
Yeah, Eli, maybe just one point to add to that. We recently conducted a study, and what we did was actually look at the material composition of 1,000 counterfeit handbags. And of those 1,000 handbags, 70% of them had extremely high hazardous levels of cadmium, lead, and other hazardous materials. And so while I agree with Dan in the sense of these aren't these massive, huge problems to the consumer, at the end of the day, that transfer of those hazardous materials is still problematic to the consumer. And ultimately, it is a problem. Plus, then further downstream, obviously, numerous other problems related to human trafficking and slave labor and financial crimes by those counterfeiters that should warrant, I think, both industry, brands, governments, et cetera, to take more of an action plan to this problem as a whole.
Yeah, Camilla?
And I'll just speak from my own experience. I'm studying counterfeit cosmetics that are in the e-commerce, e-marketplace universe. And, they're coming to us from China, and they're riddled with heavy metals. They can use, urine as an acid within the product mix. They have rat droppings because they're created in unsafe environments. These aren't being put out by necessarily legitimate manufacturers that are doing, for example, product overruns at the end of the day, where they're swapping out the highly monitored hardware for a bag with a substitute. But and so in the case of counterfeits, we've had people who have, essentially put the equivalent of super glue on their lips because it's shiny, but they think they've got a branded product. So it is a trademark infringement and it is a counterfeit. And, they've had to go to emergency rooms. We've had horrible skin reactions. And so, and the bottom line is, if you're coming across, it could be, seemingly innocuous health supplements, but they add a boost of something that shouldn't be in your body so that you feel like there's some effect to it. And the problem here, of course, is that if you're putting it on or in your body, or even if a substandard item, especially safety gear, you've purchased from, very cheaply from, some e-commerce website, particularly a Chinese e-commerce giant, that has harmful effects, and we should be concerned about that. I certainly am. I know Dr. Chow is, and I know Jake is, and we're all working cooperatively to raise awareness and to advocate for good policy.
Great, thanks, Camilla. I think as this conversation has shifted slightly from the origin of counterfeits, counterfeits being listed on these Chinese online marketplaces, and now kind of to the consumer safety issues that counterfeits present, I think it's a good time to turn to solutions. And Camilla, let's go back to you. We've just been talking about product safety concerns. How should the U.S. government think about the counterfeit issue moving forwards? Maybe 10 years ago, these Chinese e-commerce platforms were nascent or didn't exist. And so counterfeiting as an issue was really more about the source, and again, the economy starts in China. Nowadays, though, you have a much more international globalized e-commerce sector. And so there is some difference between the different platforms. And I think that pushes the conversation more into economic competition and geopolitics. How should U.S. policymakers be thinking about the counterfeit issue? Should it be a product safety and consumer safety issue? Is it a national security issue? Is it more of an economic issue? Is it something that needs to combine all of these? How do you think your average, policymaker on the Hill should be thinking about this issue?
Yeah, I think we've acknowledged in this call that, Chinese e-commerce platforms' internal policies, their anti-counterfeiting policies and their actions, like listing takedown programs, vary widely. I think that's something that we could all agree to. They vary widely, and there are efforts in international fora to try to bring everyone into alignment and to encourage best practices for brands, for consumer protection advocates, for the e-commerce sites themselves to do in combating counterfeiting. But like Dr. Chow pointed out, legal prosecutions of Chinese counterfeiters are sparse, they're uncommon, given the overall total flows of commerce to the U.S. And we're faced with that double challenge, right? On the one hand, we want trade and commerce to flow freely. Yeah. But at the same time, we need to try to stop the illicit flows from coming in. I think back to how ONDCP was set up in, I think, the 90s or maybe it was the 80s. But, there was there was both
ONDCP.
Oh, yeah. ONDCP. Oh, I'm sorry. The Office of National Drug Control Policy. And so they took a dual tact, which of course is not dissimilar to what we need to do here, which is to push the fight to the borders. So the supply chain, they divided their efforts, supply chain, and then the demand, right? And they did both. And there has to be thinking about both. And there is thinking about both when it comes to counterfeiting. Understanding that counterfeits fund conflict, they fund terrorism, they fund cartels, they fund gangs. I mean, just driving into Philadelphia one day, my husband and I saw a seller, pull his vehicle over to the side of the road and start hanging counterfeit sports jerseys on a chain link fence on the side of the road as it was game day for the Philadelphia Eagles. And, people wonder about the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in their community. Well, illicit financial flows fund that kind of activity. Illicit financial flows fund, bad actors doing bad things. So, you're asking about how, what policymakers should be thinking about to reduce the Chinese flow of counterfeits. We need to understand, like I said at the top of the hour, that this is a form of asymmetric warfare. We need to freeze and seize instruments of value to the counterfeiters. We need to flag. We need to name and shame. We need to ramp up prosecutions. We need to strengthen judicial punishments. We need to convene dialogues for solutions at all levels, involving academia, non-governmental organizations, international organizations, not just default to the standard or the classic refrain that this is just a matter of public-private partnerships. Because certainly IOs, NGOs, academia, the public sector doesn't consider those groups as part of them, and the private sector doesn't either. So, we need to be deliberate in terms of diversity of thought and bringing everybody to the table. But we also need to reconsider the U.S. government anti-counterfeiting workforce as a whole of government necessity. I mean, shout out to our partners at USPTO. They're fabulous, right? But State Department's anti-counterfeiting team was just decimated. We no longer have a intellectual property enforcement coordinator at the White House. Those folks were just let go. So if we're very serious about protecting IP rights for entrepreneurs, for brands, whether they're small, medium, or large, we need to put our money where our mouth is, and we need to, have the right people in the right places, and not, especially in government, where they can interact with policymakers and where they can convene these important conversations. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Camilla. Definitely gives a good call to government there. I would note that two organizations, OECD, with their working party that you mentioned earlier, Camilla, and then the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition has set up their Marketplace Advisory Council. So there are some of these organizations that can create forums for discussion, but Camilla, sounds like we need more of those.
Yeah, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, GIPC, World Trade Organization, World Customs Organization. I mean, there are a lot of efforts ongoing. I just got back from an Interpol conference in Lyon, where there were, major players at the table. But how do we capture these lessons learned? How do we capture all of this corporate knowledge? How do we capture the data streams, and come up with operational solutions that can really fight back against? Remember, I talked about at the top of the hour, I talked about this asymmetric warfare. We need to fight back across financial, trade, cyber, and legal mechanisms to combat the asymmetric warfare that's happening in our very midst.
Great. Thanks, Camilla. Turning now to Dan, do you think U.S. policymakers need to elevate the counterfeit enforcement issue within their negotiations with China? There have been some summits this year, potentially one coming up later this year between President Trump and President Xi. Do you think that counterfeiting as an issue should be put on the table along with things like trade imbalance and other geopolitical competition issues? Dan, I think you're muted. No
Yeah, I want to talk about the role of the U.S. government because I think it does have a role to play. But I want to go back first to this discussion of this pipeline that runs from Alibaba to Amazon in the United States, a massive pipeline involving millions of counterfeit goods being traded daily. One of the things that Alibaba does not do, which is required to do by law in China, is to check that any of the sellers on its website have business licenses issued by the PRC government and a registration on the national registry system of the People's Republic of China. These are requirements that China imposed to make sure that businesses do not engage in illegal activities. And counterfeiters don't apply for business licenses, and they don't register on the national registry. And the reason for that is that the process is actually very intensive. And so the authorities will actually do an intensive check of your financial records, do an intensive check of your business records. And counterfeiters don't have they don't have bank accounts, or if they have bank accounts, the bank accounts themselves could be shady, and they're involved in a lot of illegal activity. So they don't get business licenses from the authorities. And so the electronic commerce law has this requirement that e-commerce sites in China have to verify the business license of all online merchants. And I read your report, Eli, and I can tell you that of those 3 e-commerce platforms that you cited in your report, and I looked at those businesses, they don't have business licenses either. And so the issue for Alibaba is that it does not follow the requirement of the electronic commerce law that it verifies the business license and registration of those business entities on the national registration system. And in fact, what Alibaba does, which is very, I think, interesting or amusing, depending upon how you look at it, is that they say if you want verification, you have to pay for verification. So it's something they're supposed to be doing, but they say if you want, they tell the website operator that will do verification, but only if you pay for it. So I did a study of the service of the online sites, online web accounts at Alibaba, and I found that only half of them had verified sellers, meaning only half of the sellers had business licenses. And I can tell you that if a seller does not have a business license and it sells a branded product, I think there's 100% chance, 100% that brand is counterfeit. So now Alibaba doesn't follow the law, and the authorities are too afraid of Alibaba to enforce the law because Alibaba is so powerful. So I think there's a role for the U.S. government here, because I think the U.S. government has a role in putting pressure on China to require Alibaba simply to follow the dictates of Chinese law and to require all of their online merchants to display a business license and to display a registration on the national registration system. I'll just say that there was one group of suppliers or online merchants on Alibaba where there was 100% verification of business licenses, and I think it was for baby formula. So and of course you need that because that's dangerous if it's counterfeit. So if Alibaba wanted to, they could have, I think, 100% verification, but they don't want to, and they don't enforce the law. And I think there's a role here for the U.S. government, because I don't think that without pressure from the U.S. government, that Alibaba is going to enforce the requirements of the electronic commerce law.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yeah, in my study, I did find a number of the vendors that I purchased goods from to have either missing business registry information, maybe fraudulent information, and under U.S. law with the Informed Consumers Act, it is required for vendor information to be listed on platforms. The FTC recently fined Temu for not complying with the Informed Consumers Act. So that's an ongoing policy action. Jake, let's move to you now. Entropy has developed this AI-driven authentication tool that can help companies and consumers identify counterfeit goods. From your perspective, how scalable are tech solutions, private sector solutions like this? What role can the private sector, this emerging anti-counterfeiting industry play in filling the gaps, especially if, as Camilla has said, parts of the government that used to focus on this issue are no longer, and the issue, by all accounts, is growing?
Counterfeiters follow a playbook, and while those playbooks sort of are evolving, and as we've discussed today, they are implementing more and more creative and innovative tactics. Policy at a private level could prevent that and could move with the evolution of the counterfeiter as a whole. When I say that, what I mean is that technologies like entropy and others are fully scalable to help pre-listing confirm authenticity of goods and ensure then that not only the platform knows that those goods are real, but then it pushes all the way through to the consumer and has that transactional trust that we love to talk about to make sure and overcome some of these problems that have been mentioned by both Camilla and Dan that are so prevalent. And so I think the answer to your question, Eli, is that there is absolutely 100% certainty that the private sector and technologies, if enabled and partnered with the government side of things in enforcing updated requirements relative to authenticity, that we could support ensuring that everything pre-listing was authenticated and verified, and then for the consumer understood. And that goes beyond business licenses and what has been discussed by Dr. Chow to the actual physical product itself, and ensuring that that is all authentic and real. And it's not a huge lift in the sense of like, we're not changing or creating major friction points for platforms or sellers. We're plugging into processes that exist, but we are a requirement to their policies. And so I think policy disruption for the platforms and marketplaces themselves is the requirement in this whole collaborative change that has to happen.
Great, thanks, Jake. I'd like to follow up on that. One of the recommendations in my report is that Department of Homeland Security, specifically with Customs and Border Protection, tries to procure more private sector solutions to focus on this issue. Basically, the thinking there is take cybersecurity. A lot of cybersecurity companies have really come out of the government funding, where government has, expressed the issue through procurement. And then use that procurement power to, grow different industries. And a lot of innovative companies have kind of gone through a seed funding path, very reliant on certain government agencies like the Department of Defense. And so what I'm thinking there is, why can't an innovative anti-counterfeiting tech platform industry also emerge from, say, CBP, CPSC, agencies that are dealing with this issue? And so really open this up to everyone on the call. How do you view that potential solution to dealing with online marketplace counterfeits?
We work with a number of customs and borders agencies around the world. We'd love to work with more. At the end of the day, our technology is very customizable and integratable into programs and plans that a lot of these customs and borders and other entities are focused on. I think a lot of it comes down to focus and manpower in lots of ways, and budgets to procure. At the end of the day, we'd give it to government, right, to help this problem, especially at a border level, to affect and change these different pipelines that have been discussed today. So I think more than anything, Eli, there has to be a support and a willingness to go and partner and collaborate. And we see that in certain areas, but not consistently globally.
Great. Thanks, Jake. Yeah, I think this has to be an international solution to what is very much an international issue. So we're getting close to the end of the hour. So I'd like to wrap up with kind of one final question for each of the panelists, which is really if you could recommend one concrete step for U.S. policymakers to reduce the flow of counterfeits through Chinese online marketplaces, but also thinking about the origin issue of counterfeits and the whole supply chain. What would that step be? And this could be something, very high level. It can also be something very specific, just one step to move in the goal of reducing counterfeits. So let's start with Camilla and then move to Dan and finish with Jake.
Well, luckily I cheated a little bit because I read off a list of things that need to be done before you ask this question. I'll choose my favorite then, and that is anti-counterfeiting must be a part of our trade negotiations. It is currently, but like I mentioned, the cuts to certain government entities, government employees, we need to equip, train, arm our US government counterparts so that they are supported in their efforts to fight back at the negotiations tables everywhere and anywhere to insist upon clean trade. And that's only one piece of the puzzle. Over to Dr. Chow. And your microphone is off, sir.
I do that every single time. Okay, I'm going to reiterate what I said earlier, and I'm going to add something to it. China put the electronic commerce law requirement of a valid business license and business registration for all online accounts specifically to prevent people who are counterfeiters from opening online accounts. That's the specific purpose of that. Yet, Alibaba does not comply with that requirement, and they instead make you pay for verification if you want it, and they make you pay a lot. They have various levels, 10,000, 20,000, and you can get like a gold rating and so forth from them if that's what you want to do. That they're not supposed to do that, but that's what they're doing. So I think that that would be the one policy that I would recommend to the U.S. government. Now I'm going to add something to that, which is that online merchants also sell directly. Online merchants from China also sell directly on Amazon. And Amazon does not do, they say they do the verification of the business license and the business registration in China. But I've looked into this very carefully, and they do a very lax job. And their procedures are very easy to evade. And, I don't have time to go into detail about that, but the online merchants in China who sell counterfeits easily evade their verification requirements for business license and registration. So I think Amazon, and I don't know, frankly, if they're interested. I don't know if they're sincere about fighting counterfeits, but if they were, they also should strengthen. Now, it's going to involve more resources, money, and personnel, because I think right now they spend a minimal amount on verification, and so you get what you pay for. So that's something I think that they ought to do, and I think both of these would have, in my opinion, immediate impact on the amount of counterfeits you find online.
Jake?
And I'll just add to what Dr. Chow said. In addition to verifying businesses and having licenses and requiring a procedure, I would recommend that they require product authentication and verification pre-listing as another layer to that. And in turn, the combination of those things could be extremely impactful in ensuring that not only vendors are real and authentic and trustworthy, but the goods that they're selling are real and authentic and trustworthy. I think the costs of counterfeiting are becoming higher and higher, and they're too high to wherein things have to be done like this to change procedures and policies and have an effect.
Great. Thank you to all three of you for kind of those concluding policy thoughts. I think this has been a great discussion, but hopefully the discussion can continue because this is a really wide-reaching topic. So yeah, I'd like to thank all three of you for speaking today at this ITIF webinar. Would encourage everyone to look up my report, but also Camilla's work, Dr. Chow's extensive work in this field, and then also Entropy, represented by Jake here, just to get a sense of some of the different issues and potential solutions. And I'd also like to thank everyone at ITIF who helped make this webinar possible. and also thank our great audience for tuning in today. Thank you very much, and this concludes the webinar.